Many of us rely on pre-workout supplements to feel wired and ready for tough sessions, but sometimes I wonder if that buzz comes at a cost. Cortisol, often labeled the stress hormone, gets blamed for killing gains. Is the surge of energy from caffeine and other stimulants actually pushing my body too far? In this talk, we'll unpack the science behind stress hormones and performance. We'll look at what cortisol is, why our bodies produce it, how it interacts with exercise and caffeine, and why short spikes are different from chronic elevation. By the end, you'll understand how to leverage stress and stimulants wisely without sabotaging your progress. Let's begin by defining cortisol and its role in the body. Cortisol is a steroid hormone produced by the outer layer of my adrenal glands. It's the body's primary glucocorticoid, meaning it plays a central role in regulating glucose metabolism. Its production is controlled by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. When the hypothalamus senses stress or low blood sugar, it signals the pituitary gland, which then tells the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol. Once in the bloodstream, cortisol influences metabolism by freeing energy substrates, modulates immune function, and helps maintain vascular tone to keep my blood pressure stable. It's a versatile hormone that's essential for survival and adaptation. Next, we'll explore why my body releases cortisol and how this supports performance. My body produces cortisol as a way to mobilize resources when they're needed most. When cortisol levels rise, glycogen in my liver is broken down into glucose, fatty acids are released from fat stores, and proteins are converted into amino acids. These substrates flood my bloodstream, providing fuel for muscles and the brain. At the same time, cortisol supports cardiovascular function by helping maintain blood pressure during stress. This ensures that oxygen and nutrients are delivered where they're needed. In short, cortisol prepares me to respond to physical demands, whether it's lifting a heavy barbell or handling psychological stress. Understanding this purpose shows why cortisol isn't inherently bad. It's about context. Next, we'll look at cortisol's role in survival alongside adrenaline. Cortisol is often thought of as a villain, but in the fight-or-flight response, it's a hero. When I encounter a stressful situation, adrenaline delivers a quick jolt, increasing heart rate, dilating my pupils, and redirecting blood flow. Cortisol works alongside adrenaline to sustain that response. It elevates blood glucose to ensure my brain and muscles have enough fuel, raises blood pressure to maintain circulation, and keeps me mentally sharp and resilient during a challenge. This partnership enables me to respond effectively to acute stress, whether that's sprinting away from danger or powering through a difficult set. The problem arises when cortisol stays elevated long after the threat is gone. Before we get there, let's explore how exercise naturally affects cortisol levels. When I train, my body perceives it as a form of stress, and cortisol rises accordingly. The harder and longer the session, the higher the cortisol spike. If I'm new to training or push past my usual limits, my cortisol response will be stronger than someone who's well adapted. Over time, well-trained athletes often show blunted cortisol responses to the same workloads because their bodies have learned to manage stress more efficiently. Importantly, these spikes are temporary and part of the adaptation process. They deliver energy and help maintain cardiovascular stability while I'm working. Next, we'll look more closely at why cortisol rises during training and what it does to support performance. When I'm under heavy load in the gym or running hard, the energy demand skyrockets. The HPA axis kicks in, and cortisol is released to ensure that I don't run out of fuel. It triggers my liver to break down glycogen into glucose, my fat cells to release fatty acids, and my muscles to provide amino acids if needed. These substrates keep my blood sugar stable and prevent hypoglycemia. Cortisol also supports cardiovascular stability, helping maintain blood pressure even as my heart rate rises. It's a coordinated response to keep me moving and avoid energy crashes. With this understanding, let's talk about another factor that influences cortisol: caffeine. Caffeine is more than just a pick-me-up. It's a central nervous system stimulant that affects hormone release. By blocking adenosine receptors, caffeine increases neural firing and signals the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which in turn causes the adrenal cortex to secrete more cortisol. Even a normal dietary dose of caffeine will raise cortisol levels. When I combine caffeine with exercise or mental stress, the cortisol response can be amplified because both the HPA axis and sympathetic nervous system are active. This doesn't mean caffeine is harmful, it's about the dose and context. To appreciate that nuance, let's examine how much caffeine actually affects cortisol. If I drink coffee regularly, my body adapts and the cortisol response to caffeine diminishes, but it never disappears entirely. Studies show that moderate doses of caffeine, about 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, enhance performance with minimal side effects. In this range, the cortisol bump is modest and short-lived. High doses, above 9 milligrams per kilogram, significantly elevate cortisol and other stress hormones, and side effects like jitters, anxiety, and gastrointestinal upset become more likely. Keeping my caffeine intake in the moderate range helps balance the benefits against potential drawbacks. This nuance is important when considering acute versus chronic cortisol elevation, which we'll cover next. Not all cortisol elevations are created equal. An acute spike lasts for minutes or a few hours, such as during a workout or a stressful presentation. This short burst helps mobilize energy and sharpen focus. Chronic elevation is a different story. It happens when cortisol remains high due to constant stress, insufficient sleep, or prolonged overtraining. Persistent high cortisol impairs recovery, weakens immunity, and can lead to catabolic muscle breakdown. The key factor is balancing stress and recovery. When I allow enough downtime after acute spikes, my body resets and adapts. Without recovery, acute stressors stack up, leading to chronic elevation. Now let's clarify why short bursts of cortisol are not the problem. Cortisol spikes during a workout are part of the reason I feel energized and alert when pushing through tough sets. These bursts help mobilize glucose and fatty acids to fuel my effort, maintain blood pressure so my circulation stays strong, and trigger signaling pathways that ultimately lead to adaptation and growth. After the workout, cortisol levels drop and my body begins to repair and rebuild. Without these acute surges, I would struggle to meet the energy demands of training, and I wouldn't stimulate the same adaptations. So cortisol itself isn't the enemy, chronic elevation is. Next, let's look at what happens when cortisol stays elevated for too long. When cortisol remains elevated beyond short bursts, trouble begins. Prolonged high cortisol levels suppress my immune system, making me more susceptible to illness and slower to heal from minor injuries. Chronic elevation promotes muscle protein breakdown, freeing amino acids for energy at the expense of muscle tissue, and inhibits protein synthesis. Over time, this catabolic environment reduces strength and lean mass. Long-term stress from overtraining, sleep deprivation, or life pressures keeps cortisol chronically high and undermines the benefits of training. Recognizing these risks underscores the importance of managing overall stress. Now let's see how cortisol interacts with other hormones to influence muscle growth. Cortisol has a complex relationship with muscle growth. On the one hand, its catabolic actions break down proteins into amino acids, making them available for repair and growth. On the other hand, cortisol opposes anabolic hormones like testosterone and IGF-1 that promote protein synthesis. The net effect depends on the balance between stress and recovery. During training, cortisol rises and frees amino acids. Later, anabolic hormones and nutrients rebuild muscle fibers. If recovery is adequate, the net outcome is positive. If recovery is lacking and cortisol stays high, the catabolic effects dominate. It's a cycle of stress and recovery, not cortisol alone, that determines whether I grow. This understanding helps us answer the question, does cortisol really kill gains? Some worry that any cortisol rise will sabotage muscle gains. In reality, exercise-induced peaks are nowhere near the pathological levels seen in Cushing's syndrome or chronic stress disorders. After a workout, cortisol drops and is often suppressed during the night, allowing for recovery. Interestingly, research shows that performance improvements can coincide with increased cortisol responses, reflecting a stronger stress stimulus that leads to greater adaptation. The key is that these spikes are transient and paired with adequate recovery. So cortisol isn't the gains killer it's sometimes made out to be. Chronic elevation and insufficient recovery are the real issues. Now let's broaden the perspective to consider total stress load. My body doesn't separate stress from the gym, stress from work, and stress from stimulants. It sums them all up into what's called allostatic load. This cumulative burden reflects how much chronic stress my body carries. If I'm training hard, taking high stim pre-workouts, working long hours, and sleeping poorly, my allostatic load climbs. To promote adaptation rather than breakdown, my recovery capacity through sleep, nutrition, and downtime must match or exceed this total stress load. Neglecting any component can tip the scale toward chronic cortisol elevation. Keeping the bigger picture in mind helps me use stimulants responsibly, which we'll discuss next. Stimulants like caffeine can be great performance aids when used wisely. Doses in the range of 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight boost alertness, reduce perceived exertion, and improve endurance with relatively few side effects. Pushing above 9 milligrams per kilogram, however, amplifies cortisol responses and increases the likelihood of jitters, anxiety, and digestive upset. Combining caffeine with other stimulants like synephrine or yohimbine magnifies the stress response further. The key is to treat stimulants as a tool, not a crutch, and to use them in moderate, evidence-based doses. Let's consider when pre-workout is a helpful choice. There are times when a pre-workout makes sense. If I'm facing a particularly intense session, a moderate dose of caffeine can help me push through by enhancing neural drive and reducing perceived effort. Pairing caffeine with pump ingredients like citrulline ensures that I still get good blood flow and muscle fullness. Post-workout, I make sure to prioritize sleep, refuel with balanced meals, and rehydrate to support recovery. Used occasionally and thoughtfully, pre-workouts can be an asset rather than a hindrance. But there are also times when high stimulants become detrimental, which we'll cover next. Trouble begins when high-stim pre-workouts become a daily habit, and I ignore the need for rest. Taking stimulants late in the day can interfere with sleep, prolonging cortisol elevation and impeding recovery. If I pile stimulants on top of work stress and personal pressures, and then push through constant fatigue in the gym, I'm setting myself up for chronic stress and diminishing returns. Recognizing when I'm using stimulants to mask underlying fatigue rather than to enhance a tough session is crucial. When the signs of overstress start to appear, it's time to dial back. Let's look at those signs in more detail. My body often tells me when I'm under too much stress. Persistent fatigue and irritability that don't resolve after a deload week are red flags. Poor sleep quality, trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, along with an elevated resting heart rate, indicate my stress systems are overactive. I may also notice that my strength or muscle mass declines despite consistent training and good nutrition, or that I get sick more frequently. These are signs that my cortisol levels may be chronically elevated and that I'm not recovering properly. Paying attention to these signals enables me to intervene before deeper issues develop. Next, let's go over how to manage cortisol for optimal performance. Managing cortisol starts with basics. I aim for 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep each night to restore hormonal balance. Around training, I eat balanced meals that include carbohydrates to replenish glycogen and protein to support muscle repair. Periodizing my training is also key. Alternating heavy days with moderate and light sessions allows my body to adapt without excessive stress. By cycling intensity, I give my nervous and endocrine systems time to reset. These practices keep acute cortisol spikes beneficial rather than harmful and prevent chronic elevation. Equally important is smart stimulant use, which we'll cover next. To maximize the benefits of pre-workout supplements, timing and dosing matter. I take my caffeine 30-60 minutes before training, so it peaks during my workout. I keep total daily intake below 400 milligrams, which for most adults corresponds to roughly 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram. Cycling off stimulants for a week or two every couple of months resets my tolerance and allows my HPA axis to relax. This reduces the stress load and makes stimulants more effective when I reintroduce them. By treating caffeine as a strategic tool rather than a daily necessity, I support both performance and recovery. Now let's wrap up with a summary of the key points. Cortisol is not inherently harmful. It's an essential hormone that mobilizes energy and supports adaptation. Acute spikes from training or a moderate dose of caffeine can enhance performance and signal the body to grow stronger. Problems arise when cortisol stays elevated due to excessive stress, poor sleep, or overuse of stimulants. Chronic elevation impairs recovery, undermines immune function, and can hinder strength and muscle gains. Managing total stress load by balancing training, life stress, and stimulant use, and prioritizing recovery helps me harness the benefits of cortisol without the downsides. Finally, let's remind ourselves of the overarching principle. Stress builds you only if you recover. The overarching message is